Now, at some point, you decided to go into the academy. So after growing up in this beautiful, picturesque environment, something made you think about, I would like to do a different kind of work, go into the academy, do research, and meaning, of course, you got a PhD and became a professor. And how did you decide to pursue that path?
Mostly by accident. My parents were keen that I go to university, and I was sort of toying with maybe corporate law. So I started off in business. My father was a chartered accountant. And then I happened to do an undergraduate dissertation, and I think I kind of caught the research bug. And then 3 of my professors were all from Carnegie Mellon University, a very well-regarded university in the United States, and they all encouraged me to apply. So I thought, well, I'll apply to a few doctoral programs. Who knows, maybe I'll get in. And I was accepted at some and chose Carnegie Mellon because that's what my professors suggested I do.
I think, so we've talked to a number of people already on our series. We talked to Mary Jo Bittner, and we're going to talk to more people on the academy side. And we're also in this series talking to the industry side of the center. So we're talking to Emerita, member of the board. And I think one thing that has come out across all of their experience, and my personal one too, is that oftentimes it's little things and little accidents that drive your direction and that drive you forward on a path. And we're all better for it that somehow you ended up on this path. So whatever that accident was, I'm happy that it led you here, because you have had a long career and a distinguished career, not only in academia, but also in business. So in many ways, you really exemplify and personify what the center is all about, where we're trying to bring the academy and industry together and try to figure out how the world works from that. So you're in one person wrapped up all of the things that we try to preach in the center, the academy side, the business side, and the services side, all rolled up. So thanks so much for whatever that accident was. Thank you for that accident that brought you on this path. Now, I mentioned you've gone on both sides, so if you could just take us maybe on a brief overview journey of your career development, just sort of the highlights so we understand a little bit that path.
Well, after studying at Carnegie Mellon University, I wanted to go back to Canada. I was actually on scholarship from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. And of course, that's where I grew up. So initially, I worked at a couple of schools in Canada for about 7 years. I was at University of British Columbia in Alberta. And then a headhunter recruited me, and I ended up at GT Laboratories, R&D arm of GTE in Waltham, Massachusetts. I was there 8 years. And then after that point, I went back into the academia. And I think some people have gone from academia to industry, and some people have gone from industry to academia, but I'm probably the only person who's gone back and forth like that.
That's true. That's very true. Yeah, I personally went from industry to academia, and we know people that have gone the reverse route, as you said. But I can also not think of somebody who started in academia, went to business, went back to academia. There are very few people. I can think of 1 or 2, but it's very, very rare. Really a unique perspective, and I'd like to today explore that perspective a little bit. So my first question is taking us back in time to the late 1970s, and you were getting on the academic side that you were getting into services and doing research around pricing. What was the world like? What was the knowledge base in industry and academia about services when you started, both at the beginning of your academic career and in the business side? What was the knowledge base like, and what do people think about services?
In the late 70s, the mindset was really still product management. The idea was you were being trained to go out and work at Procter & Gamble or Kraft or Unilever or one of those kinds of companies. I was trained as a doctoral student much more broadly. Carnegie Mellon is famous for its economists and econometricians. So I was trained to have a really great toolkit and given, foundations in theory and that kind of thing. But the service revolution was starting, and, Mary Jo is kind of an exception. I think we at the Center for Services Leadership, because we know a couple of these people, Len Berry's another, we think, oh, well, maybe this was obvious. No, there were a few lone voices out in the wilderness, a couple European researchers, and most of us probably did what I did, which we may have been doing some retailing. So we weren't even calling it services particularly. And that's certainly what I was doing. The big thing back then, you know, I was a big data person because retailers had optical scanner data. So, so most of us were calling ourselves something else because there wasn't such a thing as services.
Right. And just to follow up on that one, you were a big data person because before anybody thought of big data. So that was very, very much a pioneer in that one. We nowadays throw the term around, of course, very easily, and everybody kind of understands it and kind of is doing it. But back then, certainly that was very much a pioneering effort there. Now on the industry side.
Let's put it this way. Information Resources Incorporated, that huge company, was 4 people.
That gives a good perspective on how things were back then. Let's go to the industry side. So when you joined industry, so the academic side, you started out, and there was this few lone voices in the wilderness that were driving the academy, the marketing at least area towards, hey, services is something that needs to be studied and needs to be understood. When you came into industry, what was it like then? Were they all gung-ho about, hey, yeah, we need all this academic knowledge to come in, or how were they thinking about the world?
Well, I think industry was quite different. In fact, it was really practitioners, managers in industry who were out there saying services is different. One of them, a very famous one, Lynn Shostak, as I think you know. At GTE, when I was recruited, now GTE, of course, is now called Verizon. It's a very large telecommunications company, landline, wireless, and information services. I was recruited kind of, I don't think they really talked a lot about services. They just said, look at the sandbox you can play on, look at the data, look at the toys we have. You'll be able to, you know, use the tools you have in a really exciting and interesting way. And of course I lucked out because this was kind of the information revolution, and they were studying video on demand. They were studying internet services, things that didn't exist yet, of course, but they were doing Wizard of Oz techniques in the lab. So I would say industry was kind of ahead of the curve. In fact, they funded some of the early research by Parsuram and Zeithaml and Berry, which has been very important to the field. So I think maybe academics were a little behind the curve because we'd been trained a certain way. And that was a product management world.
That's true. I certainly, from my perspective too, I went into financial services, so of a similar time frame that you were at GTE, and it was interesting to see that in some ways industry was really far ahead in asking questions that academically we didn't have any answers for. And in other ways, they were very basic, and we're really excited about some of these academic tools that were coming in. They were always so very receptive to anything when there was, I think back to the Reichelt model around customer profitability and lifetime value, that start, they immediately gobbled that up like it was the most amazing, delicious drink in the world. They were just running with it. Whereas in the academy, it took maybe 10, 12 years before we really jumped into that analytically. And so it's very interesting. And that's one of the things that I love about the center is that we have both sides and they talk to each other and they can see both ways. They can see industry is doing something that's interesting. Hey, let's figure that out academically. And also the other way, industry looking at something, hey, what are you doing there? That looks interesting. Come over here and show me that. So that's really great. And you've really experienced that personally. So that's really cool. Now, at one point, you joined the faculty of Arizona State University and the Center of Services Leadership. That was in 2004. Tell me a bit about how you became involved with the center and your experience with the center.
Well, that was a sort of an odd time for me because I was editor of the Journal of Marketing at that point in time, so that I was immersed in sort of this deep intellectual work of the journal. But I knew that I had one more year to go. And so I was realizing I was going to move into a new phase of my life. And really, you know, the Center for Service Leadership is the center in the world for service research. There are some other big centers, ones in Carlsbad, as you know, there's some other ones around the world, but definitely the critical mass was at ASU. So I was really excited that coming to ASU at that point in time, near the end of my editorship, I'd be able to plunge back into some interesting problems because almost all of my research, once I left GTE and came back to industry, has been done with companies. I'm very problem driven. That's the way I was trained. And so I just sort of want to talk to people and run into interesting problems. And so the Center for Service Leadership was great that way. They had a lot of interesting academics, but a lot of really wonderful opportunities to engage with practitioners.
And you're in many ways, you're the perfect fit for the center, just with your background and with your interests as well, all the topics that you're working on. So let me move a little bit to those topics, just so they give the listeners an idea of the kind of things you have worked on and are working on. And I think one way to describe maybe a summary bracket, and you'll correct me if you feel that's not accurate or not broad enough, but one way that I think about your work is that it's really looking at how organizations can improve their performance over time by really looking at creating, maintaining, and enhancing relationships with customers. Is that a fair description?
Yes, it is. And the part that you slipped in there that I'm surprised you put it in, but it's very important, is over time. Because from a very early date, I started looking at data over time. So repeatedly looking at the same customer and having large panels of that kind of data. And so my research is taking me in a little bit different direction. Most people do cross-sectional surveys or look at these very large, as we say, big data. It's a mile wide, but an inch deep. And I like to go deep and repeatedly study, follow the same customer, because you find out some very interesting things that way that kind of get lost in all the noise when you do cross-sectional work.
That's very true. Yes, the real world does not have a stop button where we just stop everything and look at it. The real world is people over time interacting with customers, and people over time, the customers interacting with the firms, and how that interaction goes over time is at least as instructive as looking at one point in time, for sure. And your work is some of the pioneering work in making sure that we remember that we look at things over time. So that's something I purposefully slipped in there to make sure that we talk about that. Now, the topics you were doing research on and are doing research on are some of the most important, but also the most researched topics in the last 30, 40 years. So clearly showing how important the topics are. So things like service quality and satisfaction, for instance. But even within that broad sea of things, your work really stands out in trying to do some of those things as far as over time and really figuring out what it means for industry. Can you tell us a little bit about how you get involved in the service quality and satisfaction arena, and what kind of things you were looking at, what you found?
Well, when I was at GT, like every company, they were looking at ways to improve, ways to innovate. And so one of my early studies in service quality looked at how customers' perceptions of service quality changed over time after GTE had done a service improvement. And one of the interesting things we discovered is that customers did notice it, so their ratings, their survey ratings went up. But then they actually, after a little while, came back down, because customers, they adapt to new situations pretty quickly. And so now it's, well, what have you done for me lately? Yeah, you did that last year. Now what have you done? So, and that's one of the things that it's much easier to see. If you had analyzed that same data cross-sectionally, you might have actually thought that the service improvement didn't pay off, and it had actually paid off. But the noise in cross-sectional data sometimes makes it hard to see that. So then from there, I kind of branched out, because there was that whole service quality movement, total quality management, all that stuff. And then that kind of morphed into customer satisfaction, which is kind of a bit bigger term because it takes into price and other aspects of the customer experience. And now we use an even bigger term. We talk about customer experience itself. But that's kind of how I got started, was trying to understand how customers evaluated services, and did they notice innovations and improvements.
That's really a key thing you pointed out, is that especially in the whole area of service quality and satisfaction, it's only over time that we really see the effect, and that people can make bad decisions if they are just using cross-sectional data and trying to see also results immediately, even just within 1 year, and just say, oh, this is not happening, and stop their efforts and go to something else because something else is exciting and interesting. There's a new book, instead of saying, hey, this is going to happen over time. We need to keep working on it. And so in that sense, your work certainly is helpful in underscoring that point, to to business, to industry. It's and see here, this takes some time. You have to stay the course. I have personally, and also in my work outside of the companies I was employed in, seen exactly that, where people just abandoned efforts after a year or two just because they didn't understand and didn't see that it's a year or two lag, and then you got to get around the corner and get into 8s, 9s, 10s and all the wonderful net promoter score thinking, and that's really helpful, that your work to say, hey, look at this shows you that it's over time, and so that's great. So service quality and satisfaction, do you think there's still a lot to know, or do we know everything now?
Well, I think we have a much broader understanding now of the customer experience, that it involves, all 5 senses: sight, hearing, touch, sound, taste. That we also understand it's very context specific, that customers have goals they're trying to establish. I think we originally thought of customers as a little bit more passive recipients of our offerings and didn't really realize that they were actively trying to do things and that we were simply collaborating with them. That's been a radical change compared to where we were even 2 decades ago. I think most people have embraced that idea now. But once you start realizing how active customers are, it really changes how you look at what they do. So for example, with customer retention, longtime customers, their opinions are pretty crystallized, so their level of perception of quality and satisfaction, it's pretty hard to budge. But a newer customer, new information comes in, they sort of update their beliefs a bit more, and they'd be more sensitive, for example, to churn. So a lot of these insights are very market segment specific too. So a lot going on there when you think of the customer as being, active and engaged.
No, that's true. The service field as a field has, over those 2 decades you mentioned, really driven home the point of co-creation of value and understanding that perspective and understanding that issue. And I think nowadays with certainly Twitter and Facebook and other platforms, most companies see a very visual reminder of how much customers are involved in what their products are, and how it really plays a role in their lives, and how they are trying to achieve their outcomes and trying to go for something that maybe from a product perspective 20, 30 years we didn't even think about. Those are really cool things. Now I want to go to questions and start with our first question here. And as a reminder to everybody on the webinar, if you have a question, you can use the Q&A tool, and in the Q&A tool you can send a question to me, and I will see those questions. I'll be able to put them to Ruth and see what she thinks of them. So I'm going to start with the first question from our audience here, and I'm going to read that off. There are so many tools and ways to measure customer experience. It gets confusing for companies, especially when they are using multiple methodologies. How can they simplify their selection process of what tools they use? Are there questions they can ask themselves that will serve as a filter? So the whole notion of, there's so much to do now, you have so many things. What do you do?
Well, I think that's really true. A lot of companies kind of feel that, can't they just have that one golden metric and use it everywhere at different levels of the organization and to serve different purposes? And unfortunately, the answer is no. We do need different metrics for different purposes, but probably some kind of a dashboard without getting too carried away would be helpful. For example, you want a metric that is fairly stable and changes slowly if you're tying employee compensation to it, whereas you want a metric that's highly sensitive if you're trying to evaluate if customers like a service change or a service innovation. So we do have to pick a little for different purposes. If you're really getting down into things though, like scales and questions and stuff, pick customer satisfaction, because that metric is, that single question is the most studied by academics. It's got the kind of the golden track record in terms of, does it predict behavior? Yes. Does it, does it say stable? All those different things that we'd like, it does pretty well. It has the most research behind it. But having said that, there's many other good metrics out there. I would just say that's the one that's linked most strongly with business performance. And I generally come at things wanting to ultimately link them to business performance, or if you're a nonprofit, the outcomes that you're interested in studying.
Right.
So
I know
that's a hard question to answer. There's so many metrics. And I would also say that, and you sort of touched on this a moment ago, companies now operate in the digital space, the social space, and then the physical world. And one of the frustrations, I think, is if you rely on metrics from only one of those worlds. So you maybe know a lot about what the customer is doing digitally, but you know very little about in real life, their family and friends and what they're doing together, because that's not on that digital space. Or you know very little about the physical background of, you know, where they live and how they live and that kind of thing. So another thing I'd say that's tricky with metrics right now is how can we bring those three worlds, the digital, the social, and the physical together? Because otherwise we don't have a 360-degree view of the customer.
All right, that's talk about big data, right? I mean, you've got so much data out there that you can look at, and this question is great because it really reflects some of the things we hear in the center and beyond the center. I hear as far as just, man, there's just so much out there, but we could if we wanted to, be full-time, do nothing else but just analyzing Twitter data or analyzing data from other channels and what to do. And of course, that's one of the reasons I think why the Net Promoter Score was so very quickly adopted and successful, because that it's easy just to use this one number, but of course the reality, as people have found out, is a little more complicated. So yes, I completely subscribe to your view. If you only use one number, customer sat is probably a good one to use, but you don't want to use not just one number. You want to definitely keep an eye on many things. Great question from.
And I think sometimes companies have come to our center because we can do things that are a little customized, because research suppliers tend to focus on one particular aspect, whether it's, you know, digital and social metrics or whatever. Whereas, you know, some of our doctoral students have done some interesting work for companies where they put together things that are a little bit more customized, that pull different kinds of metrics together and figure out what they're telling us. So,
right.
And that's something, one of the things that academics can actually do probably a little bit better than industry, because industry can't stop everything and run a little pilot where they try and pull a bunch of things together.
Right, and that's very true. On the consulting side, they often have a very well working tool, but then they often like to use that tool on and on. Whereas the academics, we're wired exactly the other way, right? We want to see everything that's out there and figure out what's working when and what are the conditions under which this works well and that works well. So our research, in terms of, if we call it moderators, or research and moderators, makes us always think like that. What is the scenario under which this one works well, and what is a better solution maybe in other scenarios? So that's really a different way of thinking about the world, where those two come together. So thank you, audience, for the question. I'll come back to other questions. Please keep them coming. For now, though, I want to talk about so the next two kind of topics that your work has revolved around over the years, and those are sort of the result side, right? Service quality and satisfaction is the side where we, as the company, are interested in understanding those, because they then lead to things we care about. So sure, we like to have happy customers because happy is better than not, but we like happy customers because they then do things we want them to do. So things like staying with us instead of going away, so customer churn, and things like buying more or higher value things from us, upgrading, right? So customer churn and upgrading are some of the things we've got. Can you maybe talk a little bit about how that came about and what kind of things you learned from that?
Yeah, so I've been very interested in linking those kinds of metrics that describe the customer with their behavior. So I started off looking at customer churn. You know, that's a huge issue for almost every company, and customer acquisition is still so expensive. And it's difficult to understand because the statistical models are very fancy, let's say. But it's possible to show what some of the drivers of customer churn are and what things are important for different market segments. And interestingly, in studying business-to-business churn, one of the things we saw is how attentive customers were. So say you're a large enterprise and you're holding 25 contracts, and each contract is worth $250,000, and your supplier does something really wonderful on one of those contracts. Well, that actually makes it much more likely you'll renew on all the other contracts as well, because the supplier has just shown their value and why, you're needed, so to speak. Customers are paying very close attention. I even wrote a paper on it, sort of about small details, because there are these windows of opportunity that you have where if you can create a favorable outcome, it will really drive things like renewal, it will drive upgrade decisions and that kind of thing.
That's as far as the outcome side on the business side, I find it easy to get to businesses on that topic because they immediately jump on, hey, this is really something that is going to be powerful for my bottom line. To talk a little bit about the academic side, so things like customer churn and upgrading are a little bit less traditional as research topics if you look at just the volume of papers that are done. But from the business side, they would say, I really want to know a lot about those things. So that disconnect a little bit as to how much work is done in the academy on something and how much interest there is in the industry. Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Well, I think one big thing with service innovation and service quality, and my students have asked this as recently as last week, but managers ask it all the time, is they'll say, well, yes, service quality is great. I want to create a great customer experience, but what is customer willingness to pay? Mm-hmm. And that's something, again, I've worked on all my career, looking at how customers make choices under different scenarios and understanding when they're willing to pay and when they are not. Because quite frankly, we're not just out there to sort of, sprinkle confetti everywhere and make people happy. We want to make it win-win, that there's something good for the company in this as well. And fortunately, the data will tell you what customers are willing to pay for and what they are not. And I've done some global studies around that, looking at where customers might be willing to pay more in some markets than others, and are they willing to pay more for core attributes like, say, reliability of support services versus are they willing to pay for some of those softer things like trust and assurance that you'll be there for them. And the good news is people are willing to pay for service, but you better find out what aspects of service they really care about. But again, fortunately, with the kind of data we have now, we can usually figure that out. And there's quite a few tools to use that, not just things like conjoint and choice analysis, but also we can look at actual company records of what kinds of services have been purchased and look at prices paid. And I've done that in consumer markets too. And for consumers, the big thing is fairness. Like right now, for example, everybody's streaming like crazy from Netflix because they're sheltering at home. And there's a lot of research around this issue of fairness. And what I found studying those kinds of interactive services is the customers really are thinking of, am I getting what I paid for? Which in this case, because they're streaming so much, all of a sudden that Netflix subscription looks really good. And so, hey, not surprisingly, Netflix has got a lot more subscribers than they used to have.
Right, that's true. That's on the list of topics. The next one I have up here that you worked on is pricing. So you segued into that nicely. And pricing, I find, is one of those areas where we're talking about that industry sometimes is further in front, and sometimes academia is further in front. And I find that pricing is one where academia is actually far further in front than industry. Often I find industry using rules of thumb or winging it often in the pricing department, rather than using the great tools that in the academy have been developed. And you've done, of course, much of that work too around pricing. And I think your career actually, you started in the early part of your career working on pricing and have kind of come back to that a little bit as well over time. And that's one thing where that, academy versus industry notion is to me a fascinating one, because the academic work around pricing is really advanced and really powerful. You mentioned conjoint analysis, and there's discrete choice analysis, all kinds of things you can do around pricing, including the kind of work you just described. And industry is still relying on cost plus, right? So it's saying, oh, our costs are at 10, I add 20%, here's your price, right? So that dichotomy is very interesting, whereas on other things, as you mentioned, industry sometimes is far ahead. So it's often fascinating for me to watch where we are as the academy behind and where we are in front, and why that is. So it's an interesting question too. Let me go to another audience question here. And it was a follow-up on some of the things you just said just a few minutes ago. Are there, so I'm going to read that off the audience questions, are there strategies that you would suggest when a company loses a customer? How can they work with the customer to do a post-mortem?
Yeah, there are some companies have save teams where they go out and try to, if they can't convert the customer and bring them back, at least learn from them. One thing that I found, and I learned this sitting behind a one-way mirror in a focus group room, is we were listening to business customers talk, and the business person said, well, I would never want Dave, this was this account representative who handled his account, and it was a pretty big account, to know, but boy, did they mess up on that beta test that we were doing. And so there was a message there that, you know, customers aren't always willing or able to tell you. And so sometimes to have a third party find out some of that information is helpful. So he was willing to tell us, the researchers, things that he wasn't willing to tell the supplier that had let him or her down. Mm-hmm. And it had been a very high-tech investment. It was a hotel chain, and had not been handled well from his point of view. And he wasn't going to be super candid with that account representative, Dave, for whatever reason. So yeah, there's a lot of people are out there. I would say there's probably this idea right now in customer care centers that it's easy to turn customers around. You know, they come in calling and they want to quit, and you're going to sometimes bring them back. Yes, I have seen some studies that show that that's possible. Is it likely? No, it's not always likely. That doesn't say it isn't worthwhile and that you can't learn from it, but I would partly go into it with the assumption that you need to learn and fix it for all those other customers that you're not talking to, and that's the way you improve service, and you'll get those customers back.
Yeah, that's great advice. It's roll up your sleeves and really get in there, as opposed to, hey, we have the NPS metric, we know what we're doing, and we can prevent customer churn and get them back or something. It's definitely at the level of certainly qualitative research most of the time that you really find out the truth or the nuggets that can help you make better decisions. That's true. I'm going to switch into an academic question, because you were mentioning a number of the ways of approaching data and ways of looking at things, and we've just talked about qualitative approaches as well. And here's a question from one of our viewers. How do you stay on top of all the methodological advances and approaches to data analysis? Because there's so much coming out, of course. How does one, kind of the same question as on the industry, right? There's so many tools, what do I do? The academy, we have that too. Oh, there's so many things I can do. How do I stay on top of that?
Well, I was fortunate I had a head start. I mentioned I was trained at Carnegie Mellon, and they've had 9 Nobel Prize winners. So I was trained by the best. And then I would say I've learned a lot from my doctoral students, because of course they're out there being trained by the latest and best people themselves. So it is hard to keep up with everything. And I think industry has a bit of an advantage because they have all this data coming at them. And we don't have quite that same access. I've been fortunate that often companies will say, look, can we share some data with you? You help us understand what's in it, and I can do that. But I've worked pretty hard to learn new tools over time. I mean, that's one thing about the life of an academic is you embark on this journey of continually saying, oh gosh, I got to learn something new. But the alternative is I'm just going to sit here and do the same thing over and over again for the rest of my career, and I'm not interested in that. So, yeah, it's work. It's work to keep up that investment.
That's definitely right. I want to come back to something you mentioned when we talked about how you ended up at ASU, and you were at the time editor of the Journal of Marketing, which is certainly not, well, which is certainly at least one of, if not the top journal in the academy in marketing, depending on who you ask. So the Journal of Marketing is a journal that certainly also is very clear about that it wants to see research that has an impact on the real world somewhere. And so within that role, or from now looking back maybe, can you talk a bit about what you learned about academia and the impact on industry, and how we on the academy side can help with that and keep that in our very, very front ledger when we start working on things?
Yeah, well, actually, I think people often naively think that, well, managers in industry have time to rush out and buy the latest copy of the Journal of Marketing and read it. And if they think that, I'm here to tell them that, of course, that's not the case. So I think the way you want to think about it is second order and third order effects. That we academics put out research. A lot of it is digested and acted upon by consultancies, by research suppliers, and by other kinds of suppliers. In addition, most universities have centers like ours, maybe not as long-standing and as large as ours. And the partnerships that we have with industry is another way that knowledge transfer takes place. And when I was in industry, we talked about that a lot: technology transfer, knowledge transfer. And it occurs through these kinds of partnerships more than it does from reading the journal articles, which, yes, they could be more readable. They're probably a guarantee to put most people to sleep. But the fact is, they're not intended for a general audience. It's the second order effects through the conferences, through our consultancies, through our centers, through these other mechanisms that the research does get disseminated out there.
That's a very good point. And we certainly have areas within the academy outside of business schools that are much more keeping that top of mind. So certainly engineering schools, computer science schools, they are very much thinking about technology transfer, and they are being asked from industry all the time about what's new, how can we do this, that, or the other. Whereas in business schools, that is not as much top of mind. So it's really driving towards, and there's some efforts there that are certainly underway now. RRBM is an abbreviation you might want to Google. So it's looking at the research and how it can have impact on the industry, on the real world, and driving that from the business school side, maybe somewhat closer to what engineering or computer science schools do. So thank you for that thought. Now I want to go back to another audience question. There's actually two questions. I'm going to combine them. They both ask about the same direction here. And we are living in a strange time right now with the Corona situation and COVID situation. And so we see almost live in front of our eyes consumer behavior changing, adapting to those stressors that are happening. And from that, what can companies do in order to tune into that?
Well, I actually think that the coronavirus is accelerating two things that were already on the horizon for people in industry and academia, but it's helped them realize how much more important they are. First of all is the contribution of business to society. As you know, the Business Roundtable put out a statement about the purpose of a corporation and listed that the contributions to other stakeholders, not just shareholders, was important. And I think that if there was anything that was a reminder that we all have a role to play, it's that. And it's a reminder to academia, too, that we're not just in ivory towers. We're there to produce knowledge that is important to society. The second thing that I would say is that with the advent of automation, artificial intelligence, other technologies, I think a lot of industry leaders and academics are starting to realize that it's at the human-machine interface that a lot of the action is, that the nature of service work is changing, which means the lives of employees and customers are changing and changing tremendously. And so, in fact, one of the pillars of the Center for Service Leadership is around well-being. And I'm not sure if everyone understands what well-being means, but a big part of it is the nature of service work. That we understand the well-being of customers. And one of the things I was really struck by talking to some of our center managers when we had a recent, virtual get-together, is how much they were talking about that interface between their employees and technology, because it's suddenly become so prominent, and they're having to think about it and think about how to be agile and do new things in new ways. And so I think those are two big things that are going to continue into the future in a big way. And the coronavirus has just uncovered them in this big way. How are we able to fulfill our purpose as organizations and or academics and contribute to society? And how are we, contributing to well-being of our workforce as well as our customers?
Very, very, very good points. Yes, it's all about that bringing together of so many different data points, not in the sense necessarily of big data, but in the sense of taking all these different pieces that we're learning everywhere and putting them together in the right way. And that's a very important role that we at the center have, and also as academics, we want to do a better job of. Talking about the academic side now a little bit too, you're very busy. You actually plan to retire in 2008, and have since then been, if anything, more busy than ever. So it's one of those good examples of when people say I'm retiring, then sometimes I laugh and say, let's see how that works out. So we have another great friend of our center that has just unretired recently. I won't name his name to put him get him to get all flustered, but it's interesting once you see the people that have driven the field forward for so long can't really stay retired. And in that vein, you have just now also taken on the role of president of the Chef Foundation, a very important foundation in the marketing field. You have before, since you retired, you have also been the executive director of the Marketing Science Institute, another very important institution in the marketing field. In both of those, it's sort of an interesting, of course, evolution for you, but in both of those, it's an interesting question to look at how can industry and the academy work together. What is your experience with those two organizations and how they can help us understand how to work together?
Yeah, the Marketing Science Institute has been around for 50 years, and it's intended to promote a bridge between management scientists and practice. And I would say that the big thing is that you really need to have true partnerships. From the academic side, they're really bad. They'll be like, can't they just throw some data over the wall for me and I'll go away and play with it for a couple of years and then maybe I'll let them know what I found out. And on the industry side, it's like, wait, do I really have to stop and explain my managerial problem and what's going on in the context? And it really does need to be a partnership. I've been very fortunate that I've always been able to find those kinds of partners. And I do feel that at our center, we see a lot of thoughtful managers who really do want to have a deep understanding of challenges that they're facing. So I would say that that's one thing. And, you know, the Marketing Science Institute, one of the things it does is give away money to academics to fund research that's important to industry. But I would say as important as the money was the guidance he gave on what were the priority topics and how to approach them. So a lot of it is what we'd call soft power, a lot of coaching, a lot of behind the scenes activities, nurturing, especially younger scholars who don't really know how to do this stuff well. And so that sort of continued into my role as president of the Chef Foundation. Of course, we do give money to primarily to associations to fund young scholars, emerging issues. We really try to do a lot of environmental scanning to identify what the emerging issues are. For example, in academia now, there's a movement called Responsible Research in Business and Management, and we're trying to support that. And again, I found there that you're working with a lot of other leaders, and a lot of it is about building networks, building partnerships, the soft part of it. It's not about, gee, can we get the data, or we need this technology or that. You can always work that part out. It's that time spent, you know, understanding the 2 sides or 5 sides or however many people you've got there in the room, and then figuring out a way to problem solve and come up with solutions to some of these challenges. So it's fun though, and it's exciting, especially now with the Chef Foundation, where we support young people who are really idealistic. They want to make the world a better place. And, you know, we want to help them do that.
That's great. And thank you for all the work you're doing on that side of our, certainly our academy, and certainly also for the work you're doing on that side with industry, that's helping industry as well. So I'd like to maybe get your broad thoughts on 2 future-looking questions, one about the academy and one about businesses. So the first one, let's start with the academy. What message do you have for academics, in particular in the service field? What are things to look out for, pitfalls, tips and tricks, things they need to work on, whatever it is? What is your message for service academics?
Well, I would say get out of your comfort zone. That's how you learn. And it's very easy as an academic you've got your students, you've got your research program set for the next 5 years, you've got your paradigm that you've studied up on, your disciplinary work. And you can get just a little too comfortable in there while the world is changing outside and the tools are changing and the problems are changing. So I would get out there. You're going to feel a little uncomfortable, but you have a lot to learn from managers, a lot to learn from just understanding all the changes in the world. And then for
the other side, yeah, for businesses, so what should they do? What should they learn more about or pay more attention to? Should they start reading Journal of Marketing every week?
No, but I do think there's a shift in the business perspective that's going to continue, which is, you know, it used to be the case that businesses were really focused on technology and just trying to learn and keep up with all the changes and figure out how to integrate new things into legacy systems. I mean, it was just constant difficulty. Whereas I now think that practitioners are at the point where they're starting to see that you have to put that together with the people, with the processes, with the culture, with the leadership, and it works together. So you can't think of the technology without thinking of the people component of it, without thinking of the process component, and that really brings us back to a lot of these service leadership issues. The technology itself, let's face it, it's just going to continue changing, and we're going to have to be agile. We're going to have to constantly keep up. But how are we going to keep up and do that in ways that are sort of integrated, that are cohesive, that are sort of well-designed systems, service systems? Because what we've seen before are failures in our service systems, from big ones like the global pandemic to, you know, a while back, a small electrical fire shut down the whole Atlanta airport, and it was in a substation. Mm-hmm. And so I think now we're going to think a lot more about robustness, about resiliency, about how you fit the pieces together, and a little bit less time on focusing just on the piece.
Mm-hmm. That's great advice. Thank you. So we're not quite done, but I have 3 questions I like to ask every one of our guests on the series, A Conversation With. So I'd like to finish with those 3 questions with you, and they are my 3 ifs. So I'm going to start with the first one, and that is, if I could relive something from my career, if I could live through something from my career again, it would be?
Probably a day in my life at GTE, because it was wonderful to be a part of a team of a couple thousand people, and all we cared about was that the service innovation in the telecommunications information services space, and to sort of be part of something that big was really fun and exciting.
That's great. Second question, if I could change something from my career, it would be?
In retrospect, you know, I always studied customer-firm relationships, and sometimes I had some insight into competition or maybe another supplier. I would have also tried to build in a little bit more about communities and employees, because I'm starting to see that that's part of the service system. And we simply didn't know that. I don't think any of us were trained that way, but going forward, that's something that I would like to do.
Very interesting. My third if I had a magic wand, I would.
Well, that's an easy one. I think we'd all want the global pandemic to go away. And this terrible
for right now, yes, for right now, that's an easy answer. Hopefully we're going to get past this soon, at some point soon. At that point, what would you use a magic wand for?
Oh, I would take a fabulous trip somewhere, no question.
That's yeah. I know you're a world traveler, certainly eclipsing my travel, and I'm no slouch when it comes to traveling, but you certainly have traveled further and farther and more than I have. So I can understand that. So thank you so much. Thank you, Ruth, for joining me on the webinar. And thank you to the audience as well for your questions and for joining us on the webinar.